Hello, and welcome to the Myers-Briggs University podcast, a show where every other Wednesday I'll talk about the Myers-Briggs personality types in a new way that is easy to understand so you can improve your relationships with the people around you and also yourself by learning why exactly we are the way we are. I'm your host, Isaac, and today we're going to talk about how each of the 16 types makes decisions using the Jungian judging cognitive functions. In the last episode, we talked about how each of the 16 personality types was a combination of 4 letters, each determined by their own separate dichotomies, and that while this was an okay way of determining your Myers-Briggs type, there was a much more accurate and in-depth way of doing so by understanding the Jungian cognitive functions, which tells us that there is more than one way to use logic and emotional intelligence, respectively, to make decisions. There's actually 2 of each. That's what we're going to talk about today. Before we go any further, I just want to get ahead of what's to come and just say that I'll, of course, do everything I can to make this information easy to understand and digestible because that is quite literally my job as the host of the podcast. But if the history lesson and technical explanations are a bit hard to understand before getting into the examples for each type, that's totally okay, and to be expected to some extent. So if you're in the middle of the introduction to follow, and you just think to yourself, what the hell is he talking about? This sounds like crazy nonsense. Just stick around until we get to the examples where we talk about each type and which functions they have, and I promise it will all click. I'd also recommend listening to the previous episode if you haven't already. That'll probably help too. Jung's cognitive functions were described in his 1921 book, Psychological Types, in Chapter 10, where he, 1, coins the terms extrovert and introvert, which is awesome and why I had to point it out, and even more importantly, 2, talks about the different ways in which people use logical thinking, emotional intelligence, perceptive intuition, and perceptive sensing to interact with the world. All of these words should sound familiar from the previous episode when we explored those dichotomies. There has also been some debate as to whether these cognitive functions, as we call them, were actually meant to be what many people know them as today, or if they were simply supposed to be archetypes of people, where each type of person embodies the traits of one cognitive function. There are 8 cognitive functions total, so that would imply 8 archetypes and not 16 personality types like how we know them today. I don't think that they're archetypes though, because at the end of chapter 10, where Jung outlines all of the functions, he basically states in a few paragraphs that it would be silly for such extreme people who only make judgments without perceiving things, or only perceive things without making any judgments on the matter. It's kind of funny to me that he would spend so much time describing the cognitive functions as such extreme archetypes only to be like, but nobody would actually act like that. That'd be crazy. So in the last few paragraphs, he explains that since nobody could possibly be that ludicrously rigid and incomplete in their own psychology to only use logic to make decisions without perceiving anything, or only using sensing to perceive things without ever making any decisions with that information, every person must at least have what he calls an auxiliary function, whose nature is in every way different from the dominant function, but is also not antagonistic to the dominant function. So, what does that mean? An example that Jung gives is that if your strongest cognitive function is a thinking function, of which there are 2, but we'll get to that later, that you use to make judgments, then it should be paired with a relatively unconscious and subservient perceiving function that does not impair your dominant function's ability to, function. There is no overlap between thinking, a judging function, and sensing, or intuition, the 2 types of perceiving functions. Therefore, either of those 2 methods of perception would be suitable for being the auxiliary function or second-in-command process to your dominant function. There is overlap between thinking and feeling functions because they are both used to make judgments and therefore would clash with each other, fighting for dominance. So let's summarize. There are 8 total cognitive functions. One of those functions is your dominant function that you use the most consciously and effectively. Because there are 2 types of cognitive functions, judging that helps you make decisions, and perceiving, that helps you take in information. You have to have at least one of each, because we know that everyone can do both things. If your dominant function is a judging function, like thinking, then your auxiliary function that acts as your second in command has to be a perceiving function, like sensing or intuition. Another example would be that if your dominant function is a perceiving function, like sensing, then your auxiliary function has to be a judging function, like thinking or feeling. Jung also very briefly mentions that if your conscious cognitive functions are thinking as your dominant and sensing as your auxiliary, then they must be followed by an unconscious intuition function, followed by an unconscious feeling function at the very bottom, in that order. This is the very beginning of what people colloquially refer to as each of the 16 types cognitive function stacks. You have to have one function from each category, or as Jung likes to call them, attitudes, because essentially every human being is capable of thinking and feeling, as well as using sensing and intuition, and that the order in which they appear in this function stack represents how consciously and effectively you are able to use these cognitive functions in everyday life. It is this information that Isabel Briggs Myers and her mom, Catherine Cook Briggs, built upon to create the 4-letter codes and dichotomies of the 16 total personality types that we discussed in the last episode. They created cognitive function stacks containing one function of each function attitude, for a total of 4 out of the 8 functions to represent each MBTI type. Your dominant and auxiliary functions, as they describe, are exactly as Jung describes them. They are conscious, and you use them regularly and effectively. The unconscious third and fourth cognitive functions that Jung briefly alludes to, Myers and Briggs coined as your tertiary and inferior functions, respectively. We'll talk about the tertiary and inferior functions another time, though. All you need to know to figure out your type using the functions is your dominant and auxiliary function. Hopefully that wasn't too convoluted of an explanation. If you're somewhat familiar with the functions, then I'm not too worried. If it was your first introduction to the cognitive functions and you're still confused, that's okay, because we're not done yet. We talked about how they're organized, and that tells you what your type is, but we still haven't talked about what all 8 functions actually are. So that's what we're going to do now. We're only talking about the judging functions today because doing all 8 in one episode after that lengthy explanation would be a little much, even for me. We've talked about how there are 4 categories or attitudes of cognitive functions: thinking and feeling, which are the judging functions that we'll be talking about today, and sensing and intuition, which are the perceiving functions that we'll talk about next time. But I said there are 8 functions total, so what gives? I mentioned earlier that there are 2 types of thinking functions. This applies to all other functions too. So 2 times 4 is 8. Functions can be either introverted or extroverted in nature. Today we're going to cover introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, and introverted thinking in that order. Figuring out what your preferred judging function is will give you half of your MBTI type, and in the next episode, your perceiving function will give you the other half. For now, just focus on the judging functions and only the judging functions. See which one of these 4 stands out to you the most in terms of how you relate to or identify with it. Also, see if anybody important in your life comes to mind during any of these descriptions. You might be able to pinpoint how certain people are the same or different to you in more precise ways. The first cognitive function we're going to talk about is introverted feeling, which I'll be referring to as FI for brevity going forward. The types that have FI in either the dominant or auxiliary position, or just high FI for short, are ESFP, ISFP, ENFP, and INFP. You can already see a pattern forming where all of the types end with XXFP in their dichotomy. So what does it mean to have high FI as your main and preferred method of decision making? Types that have high FI usually tend to base their decisions on what feels morally correct according to their personal values that they've accumulated from their life experiences. FI, being an introverted cognitive function, also denotes that it is a subjective function according to Jung. This means that the feelings and values that the XXFP types base their choices on come from within. They are very much interwoven with their own personal, intrinsic values that they impose on the world around them. The moralistic values start from within and work their way out to the environment. These people are by far the most likely to be the first to speak out in some way about what they believe in, especially if they think there is some kind of wrongdoing happening, because their internal moral compass is so interconnected with who they are. This can be very noble at times, as they have a great capacity for empathy, but it can get them into trouble if they are misguided or uninformed or willfully ignorant about the topic at hand, where they can become a bit dogmatic and rigid in their beliefs without offering much explanation other than saying things like, "That's just how I feel about it." This might all sound a lot like what you would expect to hear when asking someone to describe how one makes decisions based on feelings and emotions. Maybe it even sounds a little simple, where you're like, well, yeah, duh, Isaac, that's how feelings work. Something makes you feel a certain way and you react to it. Everyone does that. And you're not wrong in thinking that. Everyone does have the capacity to do that. In my opinion, FI is the easiest judging function to understand without any previous knowledge or context of MBTI, so that's why I chose to start with it. The importance of the description of FI here is twofold. For one, while everyone is capable of making decisions with FI, the XXFPs, during their early cognitive development, came to the conclusion that using FI to guide their choices was the most effective way for them to move throughout the world and engage with their environment and other people. Other types that use FI sparingly, or even not at all, according to their function stacks, still technically can make decisions with FI, but they don't prefer to because they've decided that a different judging function allows them to be more effective people. And if they try to, they won't be nearly as good at it as the XXFPs because they don't have a lot of practice. The other important part of this FI description is that it is specific enough to leave room for the other feeling function that we'll talk about next, which is extroverted feeling. A minute ago, I paraphrased from Jung that introverted functions are subjective, and so therefore that must mean that extroverted functions are objective. FI being introverted essentially indicates that you're using your subjective feelings to make decisions, which makes sense. I think that most people would agree that the general breakdown is that feelings are subjective and logic is objective. But the existence of extroverted feeling implies that there is a way to make decisions based on objective emotion, which is much easier to understand after covering the more innately understood subjective emotion of FI. The four types that use high extroverted feeling, aka FE abbreviated, are ISFJ, ESFJ, INFJ, and ENFJ. So they're all feelers still, as expected, but now all the types follow the pattern of XXFJ instead of XXFP. So how do these types use objective emotion? Well, instead of focusing on the feelings that come from within, they focus on the feelings of the people around them, both individually and as a cohesive group. They take significant note of the relationship dynamics between themselves and others, and choose to make their decisions based on what will keep the group morale high. This can make them extremely supportive people, as they're constantly trying to suss out what you need and subsequently giving it to you. These are the people who you might think to yourself, they just always know what to say, or the people who are friends with everybody because, well, pretty much everybody likes them. Because these types are very in tune with the status quo of social structures, they can come off a bit like a chameleon by figuring out where the social voids are and promptly filling them. For this reason, they are very good at assimilating into new social environments. They also might be more likely to have different personas or masks that they show to different friends. Sometimes people can get the wrong impression that these types are fake compared to high FI users who are more authentic, and I won't say that the high FE users don't have at least a slightly more likely chance of this being one of their flaws, but it's just that, one of their potential flaws, not necessarily a core trait of who they are. They can sometimes overextend themselves for the greater good, and end up feeling resentful or taken for granted by the very people they have chosen to serve, leaving them unable to help themselves anymore because they've exhausted all energy on other people, and in these cases, oftentimes the wrong people. Unlike the high FI users, the high FE users are in some ways less likely to speak out against a group's actions because the high FE users don't want to rock the boat or create tension and disharmony, even if they don't always personally agree with the choices that group is making. One of the differences between FI and FE that cause them to clash sometimes is their perspective on the previous scenario of whether or not to choose to speak out against a larger majority that the individual disagrees with. There are enough unique situations out there where sometimes it's necessary to speak out, and sometimes it's a better idea to stay quiet. Neither is right or wrong all the time, and they both have their place in life, so ultimately it's up to the individual to assess the situation using whichever feeling function they have as carefully and accurately as they can, and just to choose their battles wisely. The next function to cover is going to be extroverted thinking, or TE for short, which is the objective use of logic. Between the two types of logic, I think it makes more sense to cover the objective type first, since that will probably be more intuitive for initial understanding. You might be able to guess what types use high TE if you've been following along with the 4-letter pattern so far. They are ISTJ, ESTJ, INTJ, and ENTJ. So, how do we describe objective logic? These types make decisions based on facts, figures, numbers, and any other information that has been empirically proven in some way, shape, or form, probably through statistical significance at some point, that are generally accepted by society as a whole to be true. They're the people who are saying things like, we can see that we didn't reach our profit goal this month based on this chart or graph, so we need to do XYZ about it. Increase the price of the goods, reevaluate the sales technique, etc., etc. The most important thing here is that they observe the problem and can translate it into facts and figures, and their proposed solutions, ideally, will also have some kind of factual backing as verified means of solving that problem they are currently experiencing. If the example didn't paint a clear enough picture for you, these are very goal-oriented people. They care about results and efficiency. They are open to learning new things, but it has to come with the stipulation that the thing they're learning will be useful to them somehow. They aren't known as much for their curiosity as the high TI users are, which we'll talk about after this. The high TE users are very good at forming plans, trimming unnecessary fat, and executing said plans because, for lack of better words, they've thought of everything already. Unfortunately for me, I have to manage my own money, but if I had the luxury of letting someone else do it, I would pick a high TE user, for sure. Something I've noticed with these types is that it can be a bit hard to keep up with them sometimes, because if you're confused about why they think, do, or say something, their first response is usually something along the lines of, these are just the facts, which oftentimes is probably true, but it doesn't offer much in the way of an explanation. So unless you have all of the same common knowledge that the high TE user has, they might not always have the time or interest in walking you through it, instead just telling you to look it up, because in their mind, that information is already a given and everybody should know it. They also might have the problem I touched on in the last episode, where thinkers in general will offer factual solutions to people's emotional problems when that's not really what they need. And it just comes off a bit calloused because they retire the topic too soon because they've reached the objective logical conclusion in their minds. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have the subjective form of logic, introverted thinking, also known as TI for short. If you've been following along okay so far, then the description of TI to follow might tip you off that it is my preferred judging function, just based on the way I choose to word certain things or elaborate on important points in the episode. Or, maybe it won't. The types that are high TI users are ISTP, ESTP, INTP, and ENTP. In some ways, I think this judging function is the least intuitive to understand, which is why I kept it for last. Unlike the high TE users, the high TI users focus a lot more on the logical process of something and how it all connects to make sense, rather than the end result you get out of the process. Instead of the real treasure was the friends we made along the way, the high TI users are thinking the real treasure was the knowledge we gained along the way. High TI users will construct a kind of logical flowchart in their head of how something works and project it to the outside world. It's hard to find a way to describe TI without at some point including the phrase, "it just makes sense that way." A helpful example of how TI works could go something like this. A common phrase you've probably heard plenty of times is, "time is money." And probably another phrase you've heard, or if you haven't heard, you can probably attest to its truthfulness, is that money is power. If it's true that time equals money, and money equals power, then the high TI users can logically conclude that time equals power. This would also explain why everyone is always telling you to do as much as you can while you're still young. You have the power of time on your side. Time equals power is not as common of a saying, but the logic is there, and you can follow it from beginning to end without any lapses. It's not something you conclude using facts, numbers, or verifiable sources because, much like fi, the first function we talked about, the conclusion comes from within and is then directed outwards to the outside world around them. You can use an analogy that defines the TI users as the people who workshop a new invention by coming up with an idea and tinkering with it until it's a fully functioning device, and the high TE users are the ones who actually take the invention and apply it to things that will help them accomplish their goals, create a marketable product, etc., etc. With all of that said, it should be clear that the high TI users put a great deal of importance on understanding how something works. This can also make them great teachers, which I personally think gets overlooked a lot. I want to give a shout out to my ESTP high school physics teacher who taught us about trajectory by dropping a toy monkey from the ceiling and calculating the exact height and angle necessary to shoot a dart from across the other side of the classroom in order to pierce the toy monkey with it midair. It was awesome. Because they don't rely on external data for the source of their logic, high TI users have a greater aptitude for coming up with unconventional solutions to problems when the usual ones fail. If you've ever heard someone say that most discoveries happen by accidents that people just choose to continue exploring until something happens, for one, that is true, and for two, they were probably a high TI user. In contrast to the high TE user, though, the high TI user's shortcomings are especially easy for me to spot as a high TI user myself. One of the most prominent is that high TI users' intense focus on the logical process of something does tend to detract from the setting and meeting of goals. They can spend a lot of time learning about something really interesting and then put it down and never actually do anything with it. They enjoy learning and knowing things just for the sake of it, which makes them interesting, but it can border the line of just wasting time if taken too far. Another drawback of high TI can be that just because something logically makes sense does not always make it true, which can be especially dangerous when something has yet to be proven to be true. It makes sense that we used to think the Earth was more or less flat, because that's how we experience the Earth from our perspective. Just because it sounds correct doesn't make it so. You need to be able to supply sufficient evidence to prove it. That's what the high TE users are for, so thanks guys. Similar to the high TE users, they can also be a little too focused on trying to problem solve for other people who actually need emotional support instead, where they might take it as a personal failure if they can't solve the problem. Similar to the high TE users' struggle with emotional problems, but not quite the same. When I was planning this episode, I wasn't completely sure if I should split up the judging and perceiving functions into their own episodes or not, but now I am really glad that I did because that was a lot more to get through than I thought it would be. I know it was a lot, but I tried to keep a mix of in-depth Jungian descriptions and real-world relatable examples, so hopefully they balance out okay for your understanding. Take some time to think about the judging functions and decide which one sounds most right to you if you don't already know what your type is. We'll talk about this in later episodes, but everyone has one thinking and one feeling function in their stack of 4 cognitive functions. So even if you prefer thinking over feeling, you do still have a feeling function. It will just be lower in your function stack than your thinking function. For now, especially if you're not sure if you're a thinker or feeler, just focus on which of these 4 judging functions resonates with you the most. In the next episode, we're going to do it all over again, but with the perceiving functions instead. That should help complete the total picture about how to understand the cognitive functions to help you figure out your type. One last piece of advice that I cannot overstate is that it does not matter how well you understand the functions if you don't understand the person you're trying to type. That, of course, applies to other people you may want to type, but it also goes for yourself. Plenty of people don't know themselves well enough to accurately discover their type because they haven't thought much about it, or their self-perception is clouded by their ideal self instead of their actual self. So your homework is to think about who you are, what you like, what you value, and anything else that can give you a clear sense of your own identity. Try to think about yourself separately from all the jargon of MBTI too. Just because you think you might be this or that type doesn't mean you should try to change yourself to further fit into any preconceived notions or definitions of that type. Knowing yourself is always more important than knowing your MBTI type. MBTI is a tool that can help you understand yourself and others better, but it's not a replacement for the foundation that is looking inward and being honest with yourself about who you are and who you are not. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast today. If you want more personality content before the next episode, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/mbuniversity. For only $5 a month, you can participate in a private group chat about all things personality with myself and other members. You'll gain access to written transcripts of all my episodes, and I'll give you a fun, personalized shout out here on the podcast. If you're not interested in monetary support, that's totally fine. You can always just leave a review of the podcast, hopefully 5 stars, to help all the algorithms get the podcast to new people who could benefit from tuning into the episode you just listened to. You can also interact with me on socials, mainly Instagram and Tumblr, where I'll post funny memes and a wealth of additional MBTI information too. Links to those are in the description of the episode. If you have content suggestions or MBTI-related questions that you'd like for me to answer or address on the podcast, then please feel free to contact me. You can text or call my Google voicemail. Don't worry, it goes straight to voicemail. I won't pick up. At 216-264-3997, or you can email me at myersbriggsuniversity@gmail.com. I'll either play your voicemail audio or I'll read your email aloud, but either way, I'll answer your questions right here on the podcast if you want. And make sure you leave your name and your personality type if you want them included in your question. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I've been your host, Isaac, and have a great day. Until next time.